Welcome back, Wetaskiwin, to Steve Venardos for Council, video or part number 2. Welcome, Stephen, to our talk today.
Thank you, sir.
All right. We will get right into it without further ado, talking about all sorts of awesome things, or not awesome. Well, maybe awesome. Who knows? It depends what Steve does with it, I guess, how awesome
Depends
that'll be.
on your point of view. Like that, right?
We're going to talk to Stephen about taxes and economy right now. Steve, is it Steve or Stephen? Sorry, I keep calling you Stephen.
It's both. Pizza guy sometimes too. So.
There we go. All right. How do you plan on keeping our taxes low, Steve? Or do you plan on keeping our taxes low? Or, yeah, go for it.
Well, not to really bash the question, but to be quite honest, our taxes aren't low in Wetaskiwin. Our taxes are actually quite high. Actually, if we take the surrounding communities, our competing communities, our taxes are relatively probably 20% higher than most, and especially if we're looking in the realm of commercial or non-residential tax. Our non-residential tax is extremely out to whack in comparison to some of our communities. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but I did an article for the Wetaskiwin Times probably about 3 years ago, where I had listed a lot of some of the tax information that the city of Wetaskiwin pays. And just to give you like a rough estimate here, we'll go to commercial tax. 2021 in Wetaskiwin, our mill rate is a 23.27. If we go to Camrose, same year, mill rate is 17.03. If we go to Ponoka, mill rate for Ponoka this year is 14.2. And now if we go to Leduc's mill rate is 12.65. So what that translates to is just about in some cases, almost a 100% increase from other communities. And that makes us very highly uncompetitive in the commercial market. So to put that in dollar terms, you're going to be paying twice as much property tax on a building in Wetaskiwin as you would be in the surrounding community. So to say that our taxes are low is a kind of a misleading statement. The value we pay, so the amount of dollar value we pay on a house is relatively the same as to other communities. But the issue we have in Wetaskiwin is we're paying the same dollar value on a piece of property that can be roughly 60% of the value. So we can have a $3,000 tax bill here for I think we'll go with my house here. So it was like $280,000. And I have another piece of property in Sylvan Lake valued at the exact same price. And I pay $2,000 a year in tax. So Wetaskiwin actually has a very high tax rate. We don't have a low tax rate.
Okay.
That is one of the issues that has been hampering the city for a lot of years as far as development goes.
So as far as development, you mean we need to bring more to have more a tax base so that we can lower it for everybody?
Well, this can go to actually this is kind of loops into one of the questions that you'll be asking us later. So I'll just kind of touch on it now. The reason why I said earlier in the first portion of this interview, I think a little differently, is because the words that you just said are, we need to bring more people here in order to be able to lower our tax rate. The only problem is we've tried that for the last 20 years. They've tried to bring development, whether it be commercial or residential. And they figure if we bring it, we can drop the rates. The only problem is the rates are the reason why we can't bring that kind of development. So to say that the only way to reduce our mill rates is to bring in development, yet our mill rates are so high that it hampers bringing in development. So the only way for us currently to be able to bring in more development and lower our mill rates is actually to spend less money.
So that's the solution for reducing the taxes, would be to find cost savings.
That's the start of it, because once you lower, if we can start to spend less money, then we can begin to lower our tax rate. And when we start to lower our tax rate, we can start to bring in more development. And as we start to bring in more development, it will start to level off. And then we can start to spend a little more money because we'll have the development to compensate for the mill rate.
All right. So that would lead really nicely with the next question of, do you think our tax money that we're getting is allocated appropriately or responsibly? Do you think that, if it sounds to me like you're going to have some evidence that goes into the explanation, so let's let you go right ahead, Steve.
Okay. So as far as where our property taxes are allocated to, without sitting in that room and actually seeing, because to be quite honest, we only collect $16 million worth of property tax. And we have almost a $34 million budget, if I'm not mistaken. I haven't been able to see what the 2021 or the 2020 financial statements are, because they haven't released the 2020 yet, and 2021's financial statements won't be released until, I do believe, like May or June next year. So as far as where that money is allocated to, it's hard to say, because there's so many different ways and revenue streams that the city has. So biggest issue I have is we've had budget surpluses over the last couple of years. So to me, if you're having budget surpluses, that means you're collecting too much money from your taxpayers and not compensating the taxpayer with a corresponding level of service. So to say that is the money being allocated properly, I would have to say no. I don't think, there's a couple other issues in there as well, but to turn around and to be able to specify where my tax dollar goes to, it's a little difficult.
All right. So we touched a little bit on economic development, and I think you had some more to comment on that. So how do you think, obviously by lowering, you've explained already, by lowering our taxes, it'll bring development. So is that the key then, or is there something else you want to touch on?
I think it also goes hand in hand with our utility rates. I think our city utility rates are extremely high. They're actually, to be quite frank, they're outrageous. Now, as it sits, I'm a financial guy. I like the numbers. That's where I feel comfortable. So if you look at the city financial statements, they have a section in there that we'll call it I do believe it's under the heading of environmental services. So our environmental services every year brings in roughly about $10 million. And that would include your garbage, your sewer, your water, so on and so forth. So we bring in about $10 million through that service, and it only cost us roughly, I do believe last time I looked, it was around $4 million to operate. So they're ending up with a $6 million revenue stream. Now, the issue that I have is they have something on their books. It's called amortization of a capital asset. Now, as a business guy, for me, that is classified as depreciation. So to kind of put it bluntly, if I go out and buy a vehicle, my accountant goes, okay, well, you spent $50,000 on a vehicle. You get to write $10,000 off or X amount of dollars off per year for the lifespan of that vehicle. So when I see it on my bookwork, it's telling me, okay, well, you have to save X amount of dollars to buy a new vehicle by the time your vehicle is disposed of. We have that on the city books, and like I said, they call that amortization of a capital asset. So pretty much what that's telling the people at the city is, listen, you have pipes and you have this and you have that, and those are going to deteriorate at a specific rate. So as those deteriorate at a specific rate, you need to put X amount of dollars on the side so that when it comes time to repair those, you have at least 60 to 70% of the cost covered. Because of course there's inflation and cost rises and everything else. So what they have in their books is they end up taking off almost $2 million every year, which is roughly almost 20% of the revenue that they bring in from our environmental services. And they take that 20% and they don't allocate it to the proper disbursements. So it doesn't go into restricted reserves. It doesn't go into the proper operating accounts. They actually take it out and put it into general revenue. So for me, if you're collecting $2 million extra every year from your utilities and you're not applying that to the proper resources, we can only come to the conclusion that our utility costs are way too high. They collect way too much money for them, and they don't allocate that money to the proper areas. So if we were able to lower those rates on top of lowering the mill rates, that would even spur a little more economic development.
So just because I have no idea, not a smart person like yourself when it comes to that sort of stuff, where is this extra money, this surplus money sitting? Like, why is this money not being used to lower our taxes then?
I have no idea.
Wow.
So the thing is, and this is my personal view, we've extended ourselves in certain aspects, like the $20 million pool and a $40 million Main Street, and so on and so forth, and so on and so forth. So they have to be able to recuperate that income without actually raising property taxes. So the only way that they can do that is to create the revenue stream from their environmental services, and all of a sudden that money, it doesn't go into the properly allocated funds. So the only reasonable explanation for me is that they take that money and put it into general revenue to cover the cost of their overspending.
All right. So do you think there's services that Wetaskiwin has that, like you mentioned, the main, I guess it's not really a service, they spent the money on it, but the pool, for example, is there services that we should cut to save money, or? Well,
to be quite honest, yes, there are some services, and I'll give you a little bit of numbers here. So we're going to take recreation and culture, for instance. We spend right now over $4 million on recreation and culture just on salaries. Plus, we spend another $670,000 for contracted services for our recreation and culture. We only make $2 million off of our recreation. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't think that recreation should be a revenue generating stream. I think that if it breaks even, you're doing very well. But to put that in context, we'll go to 2011. So 8-9 years ago, we only generated $1.4 million in revenue, and we spent $2.1 million in salaries. So in the 9 years, from 2011 to 2008 or 19, our salaries have just about doubled. Yet there's been less than a 40% uptick in the revenue generated by those services. So there's something that's not quite right with that scenario. And again, unless you're in that room, it's hard to say where that money is going and why it's almost 100% increase in salaries in less than 9 years. So that's one of the things I think that can be looked at. And you can't just go in there with a chainsaw and start hacking stuff up, because that's just not logical. You have to be able to do it appropriately. So to say, are there going to need to be cuts? I believe there's going to need to be cuts in order to be able to spur on a little more development.
So you're talking with cuts specifically like salary budget stuff through, but not budget, but salary cuts through employees of City Hall, possibly.
Correct. And if we look now, administration costs are actually one of the other ones. So our general government in 2019, it cost us $3.84 million in salaries, with general services salaries included in that. And 9 years ago, it was $2.5 million in salaries and general services. So again, in 8 years, we've had an increase of $1.3 million in administration salaries. And living here for 40 years, I haven't seen that much of an increase of services, or it's hard to determine, again, without being in that environment and understanding all the nuances that go with it, it's hard to understand why there's a $1.3 million increase in 9 years.
All right.
Right. So there are some savings to be had. Now, what that's going to encompass, that's completely unknown at this point in time.
Is there any services that you think that Wetaskiwin should have that we currently don't?
I think a good thing would be probably a blue bin pickup, whether it be strictly just recyclable stuff or whether it's recyclable and maybe organics. There could be both of those. I think that's one of the aspects that we're missing here in town. I think if we're going to go on the recreation side, I think one of the things that we're missing is an indoor facility for year-round activities. I think the limit of extracurricular activities that can be had by kids in Wetaskiwin is very limited in the winter months. You're either playing hockey or you're maybe cross-country skiing or doing something like that, but there's no continuation of summer sports for some of these kids.
Right. All right. Speaking of local businesses, you're a local business owner yourself. The question is regarding quotes, or should we save money by going to outside businesses, or should we use our local businesses and give them the money? So if you got two quotes, one was a higher out-of-town quote, a cheaper out-of-town quote, one was a more expensive in-town quote. What's your kind of policy on that? What would you like to see happen and why? Well,
first thing is I'm not sure exactly how the MGA would stand on this and what the rules and regulations on quotes are supposed to be, but to my knowledge, they're supposed to be sealed. But saying that, I think that the top two quotes of any job should always be taken into consideration. Now, whether one of them is local or one of them isn't, I think that there's the city of Wetaskiwin has to understand some of the extra financial burden that we've put on some of our businesses, and we have to be able to give them a little bit of that leeway. Now, are we talking if they're 10 or 15 or 20% higher? No, I don't think that that's a logical idea. I don't think spending 20% more for the same service would be logical. I think if we break it down and discuss the merits of the bid, maybe there's something that local contractors might understand that people from out of town don't. Like maybe there's soil compaction that takes a little bit extra gravel or what have you for construction projects or things like that. But I think one of the things we can do for local businesses is if they're required to carry a bond for the job, maybe we can say, okay, well, if the job is going to be a $30 million job and you need to have 10% of that in a bond, if you need to carry a $3 million bond, maybe for local companies, we carry $1.5 million bond, right? Because you're going to get that pride of craftsmanship and pride of workmanship when you hire a local company, because they don't want the people in their own community driving around going, I remember them doing that job, and it's 2 years later, all of a sudden the concrete started to cave, or whatever it might be.
Exactly.
So I think that there should be a little bit of leeway, but I don't think that the citizens of Wetaskiwin should pay an extra exorbitant amount of money in order to satisfy local businesses.
All right. Which crime do you think impacts Wetaskiwin the most, Steve? And do you have a plan to deal with it?
Well, for me, I think I've paid a little bit of attention to those past Maclean's magazine articles and stuff when they're showing crime indexes and such. I'm not sure if you're aware of those articles or not, but we do have a fairly high crime index, mostly regarded around violent crimes. Those I don't find are our biggest issue, because those are generally people who know each other. There's generally a history between the individuals that those crimes are committed between. So I would think the types of crimes that we suffer from the most would probably be drug crimes and property crimes. Those are probably our two largest areas of concern for me. Person-on-person crimes are, again, generally involve people that are known to each other, so they're not an overly big concern for me. Don't by any means, they're not not a healthy thing, and they don't look good on the stat sheet. But I think that they're pretty much contained to a certain, again, probably to the break and enter crowd and the drug, whether it's selling or trafficking crowd. So, and unfortunately, like I said, these two they aren't a mutually exclusive group. So generally the ones that are doing the breaking and entering generally are out of a need for either a substance or alcohol or something like that. And I feel sorry for the RCMP, to be quite honest, because these crimes, they get kicked into court and they get kicked out just as quick. It's hard to fault them when it comes to these kind of crimes, because I think the justice system itself does not levy enough against it. So it's, you see a lot of these crimes are committed by 10% of probably the criminal element. So, it's hard to really say, is there a solution? Because you can pick them up and arrest them and put them in jail, and they're out on the street a week later after their arraignment because the judge is like, okay, well, so and so whatever, and all of a sudden they're right back on the street, and they generally have the tendency to commit the same crimes over and over again. So is there a way to deal with it? I think that the RCMP, and the way they are with their I can't remember which task force it is, but they do have a task force that pretty much relates to a 10% of the population. They kind of roam and keep track of the same individuals all the time.
It's called the Prolific Offender Initiative.
Yeah, exactly right. So that you can't really, I don't know how to add to that. I don't know how to make it any different, other than, you just hope that the crimes would cease, unless we deal with the root cause or the underlying issues, whether it be a mental health issue or whether it be a substance abuse issue. Those are generally why those crimes are committed in the first place.
Right.
It's easy access. Like, even if we look at some businesses, and we've had quite a big rash of break and enters, and all they do is they get in, they look at tills, make sure there's cash. If there's no cash, they walk out. And if it's a restaurant establishment, like I know Huckleberry's has had quite a few break and enters over the past few years, and they all go to the same thing. They break in, they run to the bar, they grab the liquor, and they leave. Right. So we know why they're doing it. So unless we can institute or actually have some sort of facilities to actually start dealing with the underlying issue, I don't see a reduction in those kinds of crimes anytime soon. One thing is, with a warming shelter or something like that in the winter, you will see quite a few of the break-in and enters drop, because a lot of those are strictly for warming purposes for the individual. So they're breaking into whether it be a portico in a building or an empty apartment or what have you, just to shelter themselves for the winter time, right?
Okay.
And you'll notice that those kind of really drop in the summertime when the weather is decent.
For sure.
So what we can do about it, I think this is going to kind of trail into the panhandling and the homelessness and so on and so forth. We can't attack the root issues, which to me are mental health and substance abuse and stuff like that, then I can't see a real drastic drop in those kind of crimes anytime soon.
All right. So you touched on the panhandling and loitering and public intoxication. What about the RCMP? What are your thoughts? You mentioned a little bit about the RCMP. What are your thoughts on the RCMP, from level of service to response time, the management of the officers? What is your comment on that?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say thank you to those RCMP officers. It's, that's not a job I don't have the patience to do. I could not do it. And I know that. It's like, and it's hard to criticize somebody. And we're talking individual officers, not the RCMP as a whole, because the RCMP as a whole is an institution that does not, it's not accountable to the city of Wetaskiwin. It's accountable to their organization as a whole, right? So for me, like I said, I'd like to say thank you to them, because again, I can never see myself having those kind of patience to, again, go to court for the same people week after week or month after month and year after year, and watch the system boot it back out. And, you're left there dealing with the exact same one. I know our RCMP here have quite a high file volume in comparison to other jurisdictions. So I think adding more police officers like they have over the past few years, I think has helped a little bit, but I think the major part that has helped for them is having some of these, like you said, the prolific offenders and stuff like that. So as far as the job that they're doing, again, it's hard to criticize when you can never see yourself doing that kind of job, right? Like I don't envy them at all. It's extremely difficult. Right. So again, whether the management, I disagree with some of the things that they were doing. I think that maybe there might be room in there to take our city police force and maybe alleviate some of those calls, like the vagrancy calls and stuff like that. I think those should be rooted as a community initiative, not necessarily as a crime initiative, right? I think that has to do everything to do with a community relations problem. I think that though, if the city of Wetaskiwin wants to direct their police officers to deal with these individuals in a certain manner, that's how it should be. And I'm not sure exactly what the protocol is on those kind of things, on what a community police officer is able to do as far as what kind of calls they can go to or what kind of...
You're talking about a bylaw officer, correct?
Yeah, exactly right.
Okay.
What do they call it? Protective services officers, right?
Yeah.
So there's certain things that they can do and certain things that they can't do. So I would like to see maybe looking into what are some of those calls that RCMP can go, they go on, it increases their call volume. What kind of calls can be transferred over to a city police officer that can go deal with those issues instead, right? So that's kind of the management side of it, whether one is willing to give up a little bit of authority to another police force. I have no idea. That would take a sit down with some of the Mr. Durant's and some of the other higher level RCMP in Wetaskiwin to decide, are you willing to give up a little bit of your autonomy in order to let somebody else handle some of these calls in order to reduce the workload on your own officers? Right. So, and another issue I had was with when the hub was around, you would see some of the officers and they would just be sitting outside, right? They would be parked down the street and they would be watching and they could see them doing whatever they were doing. And yet no actions came from them because again, it's through the system, right? You're in the cells for a day, you're in the court the next day, and either they're hunting you down 2 weeks later because you didn't show up for your court date, or you did and the judge just kicks it out and says, okay, listen, it's a misdemeanor crime. So we're going to let them go back into the general public and we'll see what happens from there. Right. So that one's the RCMP one is a tough one for me because again, like I said, it's hard to criticize. Yeah. When you can't see yourself doing that. When you
said when you first said bylaw, you were talking about a city police force, and in my mind, I was thinking about what Camrose has is a city police that Camrose their employees. Now, this isn't a question that I asked any other candidate, so if you prefer just to move on, we can.
No, actually, I'm fully willing to answer that. That would be, for me, that's an expensive proposition, like a very expensive proposition. It's not cheap to maintain, train, all the other to outfit your entire police force, right? So it's not a cost savings, or no, it would not be a cost savings. It would. The only difference you would have, I think, is you would have a little more control over the initiatives that those officers would be allowed to go out to the public and do, because they're responsible. Now they're responsible to the city of Wetaskiwin. They're no longer responsible to the RCMP as a whole, right? So that, to me, that would be the only benefit. But I think with the officers that we have now, I think if we're able to find some of those, that little wiggle room where they can attend some of these other calls instead of the RCMP doing the calls, I think that would be one way to alleviate a little bit of their pressures.
Absolutely, for sure.
So,
all right, let's move on to homelessness in Wetaskiwin. Does Steve have a plan to deal with the homelessness, or what would you like to see happen in the short term and in the long term?
Okay, this is an emotional subject for a lot of people for a lot of different reasons, right? So first of all, I would need to start with the information. I would need to start with, has city council actually done the proper work to find out how many people are actually homeless? Because you hear the narrative of, oh, well, they have homes, they just don't want to go to them, which in some cases is true. You also have a portion that, if we're talking about some of our Aboriginal people that are on the streets, they have shelters available to them, but they have restrictions in those shelters, right? You can't be using, you can't be drinking. There's certain things you can't do, and some of them don't want to live by those rules and regulations, so they don't attend those facilities. And then there's also the portion that they prefer the street life. That's the choice that they've consciously made. I know I've had a few friends that have volunteered at the Mustard Seed and stuff in Edmonton. And one of the conversations they have with all of their volunteers is, hey, don't sit down and try to convince them that this isn't the lifestyle for them. Because some of them, that's the lifestyle that they prefer. For whatever reason or another, that they just prefer to have that kind of lifestyle. So we need to get the actual information on how many homeless does Wetaskiwin actually have? Because until we have that conversation, there's no facility that we can put them in or build for them or accommodate them in if we don't know the actual numbers, right? So that, for me, would be the first place to start. I don't know if the city of Wetaskiwin has done any kind of work on that front, but I know when they had the hub and Jessica Hutton was there, the volume of those numbers were kind of all over the place. And I think for my own personal reasons, I just think that they were a little bit skewed. So I would like to see the city actually put in the legwork and find out what the true numbers are. On top of that, in the short term, I think that the city has dropped the ball in an extreme measure on this one. And I don't know if I'm the only person that thinks this way, but I recall about, I think it was 3 years ago, that they decided that the appropriate measure for the vulnerable members of our society would be to put out cattle shelters for them. And to me, that made the city look extremely bad. It made them look a little bit heartless. So from where I sit, most of the actions that have come from that were almost trying to repair their reputation. So they did it very, not very well, I guess, if we're going to keep this PG. I don't think that they did it very well. I don't think that they took the time. They didn't pay attention to the details. And another reason why I say that is because after the first year that they put that shelter in the Civic Center, and they did have a few issues, they didn't, for almost a year and a half, they didn't figure out that they're actually legally not allowed to put a shelter anywhere in Wetaskiwin. And for some of the council members, it was supposed to be a very high priority for them. That was one of their high priority items, or maybe even a legacy item for some of them. And for a year and a half, you couldn't, that's one of the basic things you do as a business. If I was a business and I wanted to, let's say I came to Wetaskiwin and wanted to open up a pot shop or a liquor store or a pawn shop, and I just went out and bought the building, and then I turned around and asked for a license. Well, the city's going to go, well, no, you can't put one there. We're only allowed 3 pot shops in Wetaskiwin, and sorry, but you can't have one. So whose fault is that? Is that the city's for their policy? Or is it mine because I didn't do my due diligence in order to ensure that the building I bought is actually suitable for that case? So to me, when Jessica came along with Open Door, it almost seemed like the city was more interested in getting this issue off of their plate and onto another plate. And the reason why I say that is there's certain protocols that probably, I don't know if they're in place, but they should be in place. There was no, I don't know what the business plan dictated, because again, you're not in that room and you don't really have all of the information. So it's hard to be accusatory, but they didn't require any sort of safety and security measures to be put outside or even inside the facility. They also did not require, and this is one thing that is kind of a sticking point for some people, is they didn't require any sort of financial disclosure. And I've had a couple conversations with current city employees, certain city council members, and they said you can't ask them for that because you're not actually funding them. And my question to them was, well, you gave them the building, you pay for the utilities, you pay for all these other things. So the city of Wetaskiwin, we're actually paying quite a large sum of money to these individuals in order to operate. And I know that they say they're nonprofit, but it's not hard to make a company nonprofit. There's 1,000,001 ways to make the money go goodbye, whether it's paying yourself a lot of money, bringing in other people that might be related or acquaintances or so on and so forth. There's a million ways to make the money go somewhere to make it a nonprofit. So I think that they should have put in some sort of financial disclosure, whether it's quarterly or every 6 months or once a year, just so that it keeps everyone honest. And this city of Wetaskiwin knows where their money is going. And the biggest flaw, again, I think with that was there was no security protocol put in whatsoever. And
so would the security protocol be paid for by the city or paid for by the business? Yeah.
That should have been part of their operating cost. It's, of course, there's going to be external support through the RCMP and so on and so forth. I know I sent a few of the councillors a couple studies that were done in Europe because they've had these kind of operations for quite a long time. And they were based around the policing of shelters and those kind of facilities. And one of their big things is you can secure them, but you can't make them feel like they're in jail or being surveilled the entire time that they're there. So I think for me, one of the solutions would have been hire an outside security firm. And even if they don't have the appropriate training, I think it would have been very easy for the operators of that facility to fine tune their training, give them some of the mental health training that they would have needed, or some of the other, how do we put this gently? Some of the other training that they would have needed.
So when you talk about hiring security, you're talking about Jessica or the organization, not the city paying for security.
Exactly right.
Right.
That I think was probably one of her biggest downfalls. Is it was almost like there was no good neighbor. There was no there's no mutual respect between the taxpayers of Wetaskiwin and the operators of that facility. Right. So to me, that was one of the biggest reasons why that facility is now closed. And I know a lot of people got up in arms about the hub being closed and so on and so forth. But to my knowledge, they operate a hub facility in other cities. And those other cities do not contain a shelter element to them. So I kind of got offended when all of a sudden it's time for them to close and they come across as, oh, well, the city of Wetaskiwin is doing a big disservice to its citizens. To my knowledge, she could have opened up her facilities in a different location, provided probably, I would say at least 80% of her programming without having to worry about rezoning, special conditions, or anything like that, as long as she did not have the shelter element attached. So to me, it was a little disheartening to say, oh, because you're kicking us out of this building, we got to go forever, right? You're doing a great disservice to your community. And to me, that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. And the unfortunate part about the whole entire thing is because it was done so poorly now, that it's going to be hard to get citizens back on board to do it all over again, right? Because all they're going to have a bad taste in their mouth. It's not going to be an easy task to do. Do you believe then it could be successful if we would have had a model that took care of the outside shenanigans? I certainly do. Yes, I think that if the people running that operation would have showed more concern for the surrounding businesses and the citizens that showed a great deal of concern for those operations that were going on, I think it would have been way more successful. Now, do I think that the programmings that she offered are needed in Wetaskiwin? For sure. And by no means is this just a Wetaskiwin issue, right?
So would a better solution be to have the services that aren't a shelter separate and away from the shelter emergency warming center kind of thing?
I think it would be. I think it would be difficult to have somebody who's coming in for, let's say, a drug treatment, right? They're coming in to try to kick a habit. And when they walk up the steps, the first thing they do is see someone injecting something on the side of the building, right? That's a difficult thing to, well, I know if I need to score, I know where I need to go. It's right there, right? It was kind of counterproductive for me. And I know that I have a building downtown here in Wetaskiwin, and I have a water spigot outside. And this is while the hub was still open. People would be using it to bathe in. I'd come by my building. I have people that would tell me, hey, listen, there's somebody, I don't know if you got water running outside or not, but there's somebody actually having a bath outside of your building. And this is while the shelter was operating. So if they're not willing to go to the shelter to use the facilities, the next question in my mind is why? And the only thing I could really come up with is because they don't feel safe going to those facilities. Because again, there was no security protocol in place for the actual people that need the help. And there are people out there that need that kind of help. And they just didn't feel safe going to those kinds of facilities, right? And to me, that would, the city dropped the ball in an immense way on that. And that is probably one of the hardest things the city's going to have to get over, and the citizens are going to have to get over, is to find out that, hey, listen, if we deal with this the proper way, it could be a successful program. But I think the FCSS now is offering, well, always has offered a lot of the programs that Jessica offered there as well, with the exception, I think, of some of the medical programs and stuff like that she offered. I think that most of the other programs are through FCSS. And I think that that's probably a better way to go if they wanted to bring in an outside company to help them along. I could understand that, but I think that they would run the programs quite successfully.
So do you think that the citizens of Wetaskiwin would allow, and I guess allow council is different than, because council ultimately makes the decisions based on the will of the citizens, but they can seriously do whatever they choose to do or vote. Just to put some history in context, when the Open Door wanted to open the shelter at the south end of town by the mall, there was a ton of pushback from businesses, from surrounding residents and churches, that no, this is not happening. We don't want this. Please don't do it. Then when the Open Door closed and Rock Soup was housing everybody, within a matter of 48 hours, there was a 680 or 70 page petition signed by the residents in the area. Now, granted, that was an illegal encampment, so maybe they wanted that shut down because it wasn't supposed to be, zoned for it. But it just seems to me that residents in Wetaskiwin come out in droves to say no, not here, not in this block, not in that block, not near me, not, So,
I completely understand that. It's, again, so to my knowledge, when they wanted to move to the south side, they were going to actually move it into the old Minute Muffler building. That was the building that, to my knowledge, that was going to be used. I heard Jessica say multiple times that the facilities that they had at the Civic building weren't satisfactory. So I don't understand why that building was even on the page to begin with, because if the Civic Center, the size that it is, was not a satisfactory, not the location, but a satisfactory size to run all of their operations out of, I can't imagine how that minimum a muffler building would have even been close. Right. And I think, could you do a shelter without the citizens getting up in arms about it? I think you could. I don't think that, it can be in the residential area. But if we're going to go on the long-term version of this, I think there's a lot of other things that can be done. And it's not just going to be on the shoulders. It can't just be on the shoulders of the taxpayers of Wetaskiwin. this has to be a multi-level program through all three levels of government, I think. And for me, if homelessness is the issue, then we got to start talking about transitional housing. If the mental health aspect or the addictions aspect is the main issue, then we need to start looking at those kind of facilities. And don't get me wrong, Alberta does not have vacancies in those facilities as it sits. Right, mental health facilities are full, addictions facilities are full. So the conversation shouldn't be, should we build a shelter? The conversation is, should we build these facilities? Right. Now, if you want to attach the shelter portion as far as what Jessica was doing there and doing some of the intake work and doing some of the analytics on what these people are suffering from, or is it a mental health issue, is it an addiction issue? Then you can start to separate the problem and put them into their intake facilities and so on and so forth. So to be quite honest, if you take those facilities and bring them about, then all of a sudden the shelter is no longer required. Right. In the wintertime, yes, you might need some sort of a warming shelter or somewhere where they can go when it gets really cold out, because again, not all of the people are going to seek help. Not all of the people are at that point in their life that they want to seek the help. So there is going to be a few people, and I would imagine that the numbers would probably be less than 20 that would need to have a warming situation in the winter. And I think if you attach that kind of facility to the rest of the operations, I think the citizens of Wetaskiwin would be fine by that.
All right. Is there anything else in this section you'd like to touch on?
No, I think that's about. I think that's about good for that section. I think that. I don't see any of my notes anywhere else.
Yeah, so we're moving along.
Must be done.
For sure. So let's talk a little bit about the relationship with our neighboring communities, from Musquechees, Millet, Ponoka, Camrose, that kind of stuff. How do you plan on strengthening the relationships between our communities?
I think, again, so if we're going to go to the shelter and the mental health issue, I think those facilities are mutually beneficial to all areas around here, whether it be Millet, Wetaskiwin, even Camrose. Those facilities would be mutually beneficial. And those are the kind of things that we need to talk about. And of course, there's going to be some disagreements about which community and where these facilities should go, because the eventuality is, of course, those are going to bring some pretty decent paying jobs. They're going to bring some a little different outlook to that city. So they would be beneficial to all of the municipalities, not just Wetaskiwin. As far as Musquechees goes, I think that they're doing a fairly decent job as it is now, connecting with the leadership in those communities. I think it could always, of course, the relationships could always be better. I think for me, one of the big issues for me is if you drive into Wetaskiwin from the north, the east, or the west, there's not one thing in the city of Wetaskiwin that would say, hey, listen, do you realize that there is probably 10 to 15,000 Aboriginal people less than 10 minutes away from your city? Is there anything here that would dictate that? I don't think so. I don't think that there's no Aboriginal art. There's none of their history, none of their culture to actually make them feel like they're welcome here. And this was going to go to the kind of leads into the next question about some of the reparation stuff that's going on. And of course, today, the Orange Shirt Day. That's why I'm wearing orange with my orange wall. Although
it's 2 weeks later, so yes, when we recorded the interview, It was Truth and Reconciliation Day, but people are hearing this.
So those are some of the issues with Musquechees that have to be addressed. It's hard for them to come into the community and feel welcome when really there's nothing of their heritage here at all whatsoever, with the exception of the Peace Hills Caring. Right. And since they've moved that, they kind of tuck that away in the back corner, so people don't really see it.
Yeah.
Right. And that's a different situation altogether. But
do you think City Council did enough, or is doing enough, or should do more regarding truth and reconciliation with their neighbors?
It's, for me, I'm not I'm not comfortable imposing my viewpoints on that because, again, I didn't suffer from those conditions. I'm not a victim of those conditions. So it's hard for me to say, well, listen, this is what I think you should do, because I think they've had enough of people of my skin color telling them what they should and shouldn't do. Now, as far as the commissions and everything else go that they're putting forth in order to get information on what they would like to see done, I think that they're doing quite a bit. Their diversity and inclusion task force that they're doing and some of those other initiatives that they're doing, I think that they should continue doing them. I think that they should continue gathering the information, and we should heed to what the outcomes of those groups have to say. Like I said, I don't think that I'm in a position to say, hey, listen, this is what I think you need. I think that they've had enough of that.
Right. All right, moving right along, Steve, let's talk a little bit about current council. What, if anything, is council getting right, and what, if anything, is council getting wrong? And this is more a base.
Such a smile on your face when you say that.
Well, sometimes you hear some good stuff, but I'm not looking for specific people on council. This is more of a question of what decisions in the last 2 or 4 years, because we've had a by-election, so there's some councillors that were only on for 2 years.
Yeah.
But have you said that you've heard that they've made that it's like that is perfectly in line with my goals and strategies? And then the opposite end of the spectrum is, listening to the decisions come out of the council meetings. Is there anything that you would have wished or hoped that they would have gone the other way on?
First of all, a couple of the things that I like that they did. They've got a grant writer they brought in, and they strictly write. As far as I know, their job is strictly to write for grants that are being either by federal or provincial government. I'm not sure if they do both or if they just do the provincial. But they've been very successful at that. They've got a lot of provincial money and provincial programming coming in through their grant writing. That, I think, is a very good thing that they did. One of the other things that they did, and I harped on this probably 3 years ago when I wrote that article called Wetaskiwin by the Numbers, was their debt level. Their debt level was astronomical. Now it's down to, I think it's just over $7 million. Now, mind you, there's a pro and a con to that. The pro is, yes, they pay down their debt. The con is it's been on the backs of the taxpayers through, again, high property value or high property rates, high utility rates. They've been using that money in order to pay down excessive spending in the past. So yes, it's great that they've dropped their budget, they've dropped their debt load, but again, that's been on the back of the taxpayers. So it's kind of hard to go, yay. At least they didn't spend it frivolously, I guess you could say. Right. So that's always a bonus.
For sure. And in the flip side of it, or did we kind of touch on everything there?
Well, there's a couple things. So on the flip side of it, we had the sale and the development of Boulevard 1961, I think it is called. So that's the location where the Peace Hills Carum used to sit. One of the reasons why I say this was an extremely bad deal is because there's two sides to this coin. First of all, the way they handled the sale of the property to begin with. And to my knowledge, when you put a piece of city property up for sale, you have to advertise it for, I do believe it's 2 weeks. For open tender. Now, when they put that piece of property up for sale and offered it for open tender, it did not include the parking lot that was beside it. Why it didn't include the parking lot, I have no idea. But it did not include that parking lot. So when I first looked at the proposal, I was like, well, nobody's going to buy this chunk of land without the parking lot. It's not feasible. And then all of a sudden, before you know it, the property had sold with the parking lot. And I was like, well, how come the parking lot was never offered to public tender? And the only thing I can come up with is that there is a clause in the MGA that if the piece of property is only worth over a certain value, is the time that they have to, if it's over X amount of dollars, then they have to put it out for public tender. If it's not, then they don't have to. And I think it was kind of a little bit shady the way they kind of skidded that in between there. And not only that, but also the way that Dave Dollar was treated as opposed to that piece of property. I don't think he was given a fair opportunity to purchase that piece of land at that point in time. So that was one of the reasons why I think that was a bad property deal. The other reason why I think that was a bad property deal was because I do believe the sale price on that piece of land was $625,000. Now, not a bad price. That's not a bad price until you consider that that's probably your prime piece of commercial real estate in your city. It's on the corner of Main and Main. Now, what makes this deal more disturbing is, okay, so the property was sold for $625,000. It cost the city, I think it was $100,000+ to move the Peace Hills Caravan, put in its current location. But the city also paid for all of the groundwork to be done in order for the plumbing and everything else to be installed, which cost the city, again, another $100,000+. So at the end of the day, you have the property value dropped from $625,000, and I think their net profit on that was $325,000. So the cause and effect that they don't understand is you have a piece of property that's, again, your prime commercial location. It has probably a 2,000 square foot building on it, and real property value is only $325,000. So what that in turn did is it lowered the property value of every single piece of property on the Ottawa. And considering one of our biggest deterrents for development is a high mill rate, you turn around and devalue all of your property, don't change the way you budget, there's only one outcome, and that's raising of the mill rates. So that's the reasons why I think that deal was a really bad one, because not only did you not get fair market value, I don't think, for that piece of property at the end, is you ended up actually adding to the current problem that we already have of high mill rates. So that was one of the things that I wasn't too keen on with the city council. Another one is that the city council runs budget surpluses. They shouldn't be running budget surpluses. They shouldn't be taking more money from their citizens than they need to operate their city. And I just think, again, that goes back to how did you drop $5 million worth of debt last year, right? That's kind of where that money comes from, is budget surpluses, overcharging, so on and so forth. So that was the other one. Let's see, what else do I have here? Missing utility charges. How do you go for 11 months and not notice that you didn't add the sewer surcharge to your water bills? How does every city council member not look at a water bill? And the reason why, for me, is they just totally forgot they did it. Because when they passed their budget at the end of that fiscal year, in December, and I can't remember which year it was exactly, but when they passed their budget at the end of that year, they did not have that surcharge in it. They strictly waited till the next council meeting, when more people don't pay attention because it's not the budget, it's not everything else. They waited till January, then the following year, and kind of slid it in under the table. And they slid it so nicely that they totally forgot that they put it there. So you go 11 months without charging this bill, and then all of a sudden, you don't have the infrastructure money you were counting on. You can't, how many projects got delayed, how many projects, just got canceled altogether, because all of a sudden there's $1 million+ that's no longer there in the coffers that should have been, right? So to me, again, attention to detail goes back to the same thing with the hub, attention to detail. They're not paying enough attention to the details. High mill rates, of course, has been an issue here for years. And I don't think we can afford another 4 years of the same ideology. The same ideology we've had for the last 20 years. It has not changed. The growth rate in Wetaskiwin is, I don't want to say none, but it's probably less than 2%. I would say less than 2% growth. The other one is the inability to combat our extremely low property values. And again, to me, that goes back to development. If you don't bring in new housing that costs more money, then it does not allow the lower property values to come up in price, right? And that is, for me, one of the other issues that Wetaskiwin faces is how much income the average person in Wetaskiwin makes. And I think they did their mixed, I think it was a mixed business platform that they did. They hired somebody to do an analysis of all that stuff. And if you look at that, the average income of Wetaskiwin is probably 10 to 15% lower than surrounding communities, right? So that's a lot of disposable income that's not there. But one thing, again, Wetaskiwin has a very affordable housing market. Or that's probably one of the only communities around that you can actually afford to own a house if you're on a 2-income minimum wage household, which there's not too many communities out there that you can actually do that. Now, is that kind of beneficial? Yes. But on the same note, that's very indicative of the jobs that you have in your market, right? And that's one of the other issues is we don't have those high paying jobs. If I had to look at it, from one aspect, we're a government town. A lot of our income comes from the government, whether it be teachers, hospital workers, extended care facilities, their employees, anything to do with Alberta Health Services, anything to do with any programs that the city or the province provides, all government funding. And then you turn around and you look at the amount of age recipients, the amount of old age pension recipients, that's all government money. And that's how Wetaskiwin survives. It survives on government money. So we need to finally decide that if we're going to go government, we better go all the way. We better try to get as many of those facilities as possible in order to try to increase our disposable income for our citizens, right? So that's one of the other issues that I had with one of these, with this city council. Plus there have been, and this might not be on city council, but again, there's been financial improprieties by some of at least one of the employees that was head of the protective services department. That can't be allowed, that kind of thing. And I know that they were dismissed and they can't tell you why. It was just either dismissed with cause or dismissed without cause. There's no elaboration, whether, they're not allowed to elaborate on it or they choose not to elaborate on it. I'm not sure. Because again, I don't have the knowledge of the inner workings of that kind of system, right? So that's kind of hard to say. And the other one would be not making sure that money earned by certain services is actually allocated to the proper areas. We'll go back to the water rates and so on and so forth. When you're taking out that much money and not putting it back into the proper places, I don't agree with that. I don't agree that telling us that it's a user pay system and we only charge you what it costs us to operate the system, and we put a little away for future construction and so on and so forth, and then turn around and take $2 million out of that and put it somewhere else. And the only thing I can assume is it goes into general revenue. So where it goes from there, it's just, there's so many different ways you can make it disappear and go to wherever you want it to, that, again, unless you're sitting in that room, you don't really know where it disappeared to. So that would have been one of the other ones. And again, the hub, that was probably one of the biggest fiascos I think that this city council did. And I think that was all out of the need to kind of save face. I don't think that they, again, didn't pay attention to details. Are you talking about the opening of it or the agreement to let Open Door use it? Or are you talking about the closure? I think it goes all the way, again, it goes all the way back, for me, it goes all the way back to the time when they decided cattle shelters were a good thing to put out for the vulnerable members of our community. I think that's where it started. I think that that's where they started their own demise in that aspect. And then not facilitating the proper steps after that. Again, you go a year and a half without knowing that you can't put it in a place. If it's supposed to be, and according to them, it was a very high concern on their part. So to me, that's not acceptable to wait a year and a half to find out that you can't put it somewhere. Right. So for me, that one's a little difficult to swallow. Mm-hmm. And as far as that goes, I think that's probably about the most of what really irritated me, other than the way they treat people when you go in there to present. When I went in there to present to them, so the information, I spent probably 4 or 5 months gathering. I gathered them all the information on tax rates. I gathered them all the information on utility rates in surrounding communities. I gave them all the information on the minimum or the average wage, the average income, the medium income. I gave them all of that information 3 years ago. I sat in that room and I presented to them for 45 minutes. I've seen more counselors staring at their phones like they had something better to do with their time. I didn't get 2 words out of anybody in that room, including not even the thank you very much. Thank you for your effort. And the way I look at it is when somebody comes in there to present them with some of that information, they take it as an attack on them and not as a community member trying to be beneficial to their community. And that I have a big problem with. You know, if you can't put aside your own egos or whatever it might be in order to actually consume this information and try to put it where it actually belongs, then I have a big issue with that. You know, and I don't think I'm the only one that's presented to that city council that felt totally disrespected or whatever else from that city council. Now, granted, that was prior to the last by-election, so not all of those city councilors would be included in that, but there was quite a few.
Right.
And the accessibility of them too, because I offered to, you know, interview all of them. I wanted all of their, kind of doing what you're doing, I wanted all of their inputs on, you know, the financial aspects of Wetaskiwin and where the money goes and so on and so forth. And I had, I think 3 city councilors sat down with me, nobody else would. Right. So that's kind of disheartening as well, right?
Right, that's for sure. So, well, one for sure thing is if you get elected, you can certainly look into all of these things and provide your expertise. And
that's one of the main things and one of the main reasons why I am running. It's because, again, it's we need a change. We need the whether it's an ideological change or whether it's just the way they think. Like I would prefer to change the way people think, not what they think.
Right.
If you can change the way somebody thinks and how they process information in a different manner, it's a lot harder to try to sway them with Facebook facts than it is to if you change the way they think, right? If you just change what they think, they can turn on Facebook and find something to feed their own agenda or feed their own point of view, right? That's one of the things that I'm not a big fan of social media. So
right. All right. All right. Moving right along. We've probably talked about this and you've probably explained it in detail, but what do you think Wetaskiwin's biggest problem is and what's the solution? I know it's kind of a generic question and you've touched on a lot of stuff.
For me, that goes back to, again, growth. Growth is one of our biggest problems. We don't grow. That's just the fact of the matter. We haven't grown in a long time. Growth is one, and spending, of course, is the other. I don't think that we spend appropriately. I think we've taken too much liberties with our taxpayers' money. I think that some of the facilities that we built were not necessary. Whether it was a legacy piece for certain individuals or whether it was just ill-advised, but there was other ways of, I think, operating some of those choices that it would not hamper the city of Wetaskiwin for so many years and put us in a very difficult position. I think those are probably some of the biggest problems in Wetaskiwin. And until we can, again, it goes to the how people think thing is, you said it earlier, you probably have heard a number of the current city councilors say it as well. Well, we need to bring in more tax base. If we want to lower the tax rate, we need a bigger tax base. The only problem is under the current conditions, you're never going to get a bigger tax base. So to want a bigger tax base so that you can lower mill rates without doing the initial sacrifice to lower those mill rates to begin with, it's kind of counterproductive to me. It's the very definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. And they've tried it for the last 20 years, at least 20 years, to bring in new development, and they haven't been able to do it.
Right.
You know, as Alberta's economy is booming, Wetaskiwin does not have a boom-bust economy. Wetaskiwin is a pretty flat economy. So the way I look at it is if Edmonton booms and then Leduc booms, then Wetaskiwin will probably catch up a year or two after that. But on the other side of that coin as well, when Edmonton starts to deflate and Leduc starts to deflate, it takes another couple of years for Wetaskiwin to start deflating. That's why we pretty much stay at that even level all the way across.
Right.
Right. So again, that's one of my biggest issues. One of the fixes I think would be, again, spend less. I said it earlier, there's a couple departments that some of them have almost doubled in what they spend in a year. And to be quite honest, you don't see the results of that doubling in money. You don't see, like if we go to recreation, for instance, I don't see a new arena or reason why it would cost more to run those arenas. I don't see the reasons for why it costs more to have your ball diamonds. I don't see reasons for why it costs you more to have the swimming pool, other than, you know, it's just a really big pool. And of course, some of the expenditures are going to be higher because of some of the facilities they have in there. But I don't see how that translates to wages, to actually salaries and so on and so forth, of why it would cost twice pretty much what it did 9 years ago to operate almost the identical facilities we had 9 years ago. Right. So there's got to be a method of savings within there. And I don't know where it is, because again, unless you're in that room and you see all of the work, all the paperwork, it's really hard to determine. And our city council is notorious for not being very transparent. Right. So it's hard to say when they won't give you the information. And I went through this again when I wrote that article. You know, I sat down with, he's not a current member of that administration. He has since been let go. But the thing was, well, yeah, we'll provide you that information. Just give us a little while. So I gave him 6 months. And after 6 months, we went to, I went to the open house that they had, because they were starting to charge 50% on infrastructure projects to homeowners, I think is what it was. A lot of people were not very happy about that ideology of, hey, listen, we know we charge you taxes. We know you pay all of this money. But when we want to do the sewer in front of your house, you're going to have to pay 50% of it. Because over the past X amount of years, they didn't put any money away for infrastructure upgrade at all whatsoever. So now we're going to charge you 50%. And when I went to that meeting and I brought it up that, you know, I've been looking for this information for the last 6 months, all of a sudden the next response was, well, if you want that information, go fill out a Freedom of Information Act request. It's like, okay, well, why didn't you tell me that 6 months ago? You told me you were going to provide me with the information. But now 6 months later, when it's in public and you've been put on the spot, all of a sudden it's, well, no, go fill out a Freedom of Information Act request and we'll get to you when we get to you. And by the way, you got to pay for all the information that we're going to go and access for you. Right. So again, that's transparency issue. Right. And that hasn't changed at all whatsoever.
Okay. Your vision for Wetaskiwin, Steve, tell us what you'd like to see, how Wetaskiwin would look. How
Wetaskiwin would look, are we talking about this as...
Well, just your vision, like kind of how you would, if you're in council and everything kind of goes the way you want it to go, how would we be different? What would it look like? What would happen?
I think the difference would be, that's a kind of a tough question to answer, right?
It's all guessing, right?
It's all hypothetical,
but
right?
I think it's a vision. Like you obviously, you have obviously would want. There's things you would do right away when you got in to get the information that you needed to get, and based on the information you find and the savings you can provide, you know, in 4 years from now, will our taxes be way less? Our mill rates will be less. Like what's the vision that you want for our citizens?
The vision I have would be an actual affordable city. And I know that some of these other candidates say Wetaskiwin is extremely affordable, but again, I don't look at things the same way most people look at them. So when I did write that article 3 months ago, the city brought out put out a couple one-page graphs, and they named the graphs exactly what I named my article of Wetaskiwin by the numbers. Now, they brought out these graphs in order to try to disprove what I had wrote in my article. The unfortunate part is one of the graphs to a T actually stated exactly what I put in that article. And the main reason why I have a big issue with when they say City of Wetaskiwin was affordable, it's one of the cheapest places to live. The only reason why it's so cheap to live here is because house values are so low. And I'm like I don't look at it like most people. I don't look at my mortgage as a cost of living. That's a cost of saving to me, because that's my money. I get to keep that money. That's money that a lot of people save for retirement, so on and so forth. What does cost a lot of money is what I pay my municipality. And the graphs that they showed by far that Wetaskiwin pays for the what the average person pays per month in Wetaskiwin, mortgage, utilities, and property tax. The largest percentage of that payment goes to the City of Wetaskiwin. They collect more money as a percentile wise of what my monthly cost is than any other municipality, including Calgary. But Calgary is so expensive and skews the scale because their house value is so high, right? When they show the study. So, I would like to see a more affordable place to live. I'd like to see a more business friendly place to live. And that's one thing that I think that I could very much help with, is again, showing a different way of thinking. It can't be the same old of, they always use the term of, oh, well, if you want to spend less money, then you're going to affect services. And I don't equate the two to where are we going to see the depletion in service? What services are going to deplete if we spend less money in recreation? What less services are going to deplete if we spend less money in administration costs, right? Like we have probably, when I think I did my research, we have one of the highest paid mayors per capita in Alberta for a part-time job. That's almost $80,000 a year we pay our mayor. That's a lot of money for a part-time job. Now, I'm not sitting in that room and I can't say exactly how much work has to be put in and so on and so forth. I'm sure there's quite a bit, but if we're paying that much per citizen in Wetaskiwin, I think there's something that has to be looked at, right? So again, unless you're in that room and you know all the little intricacies, it's hard to say that, oh yeah, well, this has to be slashed or that has to be slashed. I can't just go willy-nilly style like that. It has to be information-driven action, not just, oh, well, off the cuff, that's what I feel, so that's how it's got to be. Right. I don't like that. How do they put it? If your glass is already full, there's no way you can add more knowledge. Right. Just flows out. Yeah. I prefer to go in half empty. Right. That way I got room to fill it up. Right. Awesome. So. All right. A couple more questions, Steve, and then we're going to let you get out of here. If you had access to unlimited resources, what would you do? So this is kind of like a fairy tale kind of a question. Well, for me, this is going to annoy a lot of people. And I know it's going to annoy a lot of people. But I would go after the education system. And by that, I don't necessarily mean change the curriculum and change that sort of thing. I think that there's a lot of shared use programs that the city of Wetaskiwin could institute. I think that a Catholic high school could be used. I think the way that we offer an education can be changed. Like, let's say, for instance, if the city of Wetaskiwin can work together with Catholic school organization to petition the federal government or provincial government for an actual Catholic school system. Yes, if you get the high school here, there might not be quite the population in order to satisfy their needs. But if you can turn around and turn the school system into specialty school systems, like my daughter, for instance, if she's a high level achiever, there's no AP courses for her to take here, right? So if she's going to take AP courses, she has to go to either Edmonton or she has to take them by correspondence. right? And we all know how many students just absolutely loved learning from home during the pandemic, right? It didn't go well for quite a few students. So if we could manage to go, let's say if you want to take a Catholic high school and turn it into an art school and an athletic school, and then you have the Wetaskiwin Composite High School and you want to turn it into higher education and a trade school, right? There's got to be a funding model that can turn around and say, okay, listen, we're going to take 150 kids per year from one school and we're going to integrate them we're going to cross integrate them into cross programming, right? So that can help the Catholic system fill out some of their vacancies that they might have if there's not enough population to fill it. I think education is one of those things that if you can provide a good education for kids, I think more people would move to your community. I think that if you can provide that education, parents would be more willing to travel the extra half an hour, 45 minutes for them to go to work in order to benefit their children, right? And I also think that there's some other things that you could do with that kind of system. Let's say you wanted a indoor field house. So again, a shared cost, a shared user program between the city and the school system. So let's say the city pays for 70% of its construction. The school system pays for 30% of the construction. The school system gets to use that facility at their will, certain parts of that facility or however that might work. And the city will provide the employment in order to keep it running. Again, maybe the public library. Public library right now rents a building. That's, to me, that's public infrastructure. You should not be renting a building for a public facility. So then there's another thing. So now all of a sudden you can integrate a new public library. Okay, well, the one school system gets to use that library as their main library for their school. They can apply and use one of their employees to cover X amount of hours of work. So all of a sudden now you're lowering costs. So there's mutually beneficial arrangements that you can make between the systems in order to make this possible. Now, a lot of people aren't going to like that. A lot of people, like I remember when we did the last forum and we were asked actually the same question. If you had $1 million, where would you put it? And I said education. And almost 90% of the other candidates went, you can't touch education. You've had principals, school teachers, all sit on city council. Not one of them has ever tried to do shared use programs with the city and school systems. You know, like let's say one of the schools wants to put on some sort of drama or music or yada, 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 yet their gymnasiums aren't big enough. So they want to use the Memorial Arts Center. Do you charge them for it? Or do you just say, here, you get to use this facility? But, you know, when we have some sort of city program going on and we need a learning center, we're going to use some of your classrooms, right? Those are mutually beneficial arrangements that you can make between the two. That doesn't cost the city any money, and again, doesn't cost the school system any money, right? So those are some of the facilities that you can interchange with one another, right? And I think that if you could bring in a specialized sports system, a specialized arts program, and even the trade system, especially now that trades are in demand in a major way. And I think that would also goes to mutually beneficial programming to help some of our surrounding neighbors, whether it be Musquecheese or whether it be Winfield or some of the other schools or even Millet. All of a sudden you're going to be getting that influx of students because the programming is there. Mm-hmm. And once the programming is there, then all of a sudden you'll start bringing those students into your city, which in turn will probably spur on to a little bit of growth, right? So those are kind of, if I had unlimited kind of money, that's kind of things I would do. Interesting.
Awesome. All right, I have two more bonus questions for you, or questions. One, the first is on COVID-19. Do you think that the city, with the vaccination rates in the city compared to the province being quite a bit lower, do you think it's the city council's role to step up and impose further restrictions on our citizens, or should we just kind of follow the guidelines of Alberta Health?
You like touching on all the sticky ones, eh?
Well, you know, I asked everybody else, so I had to ask you.
Let's get a visceral reaction out of this question. Do I think it's the city of Wetaskiwin's job to institute stronger regulations? No, I don't think so. I think that should should be up to the province. I think that is, of course, whether you think that they've done a good job of doing it or a bad job of doing it, that's neither here nor there. But I don't think that it's the city of Wetaskiwin's job to tell people that, hey, listen, I know the federal government hasn't instituted this, but we're going to make you do it on top of it, and we don't care. I don't think that that's the city's job. I think it's got to be a societal position and not just the city of Wetaskiwin's position.
Okay. And then the second question is the federal election that just happened. How pleased are you with the results? What are your thoughts on the federal election?
I don't know if I would say if I was pleased. As you can tell, I'm a pretty fiscal right kind of individual, but I'm also a socially left kind of individual.
That was my last question was, if Steve Venardos was a political party and you had to align yourself closely with one of them or your platform, would it resemble obviously NDP, Conservative, Liberal, Green Party?
To be quite honest, it wouldn't be any of them, because I don't think, to be quite honest, I don't think that the PC party does kind of align with some of my fiscal ideology, but again, on the other side, the Liberal Party kind of maybe a little too far. Right. I'm not a big fan of entitlement without responsibility. And I think that the Liberal government is a little too much of entitlement without responsibility. So I couldn't really align myself with the left, but I can't really align myself with the PCs with some of their lack of acknowledgement of climate change and some of the other things where they won't even put it on their platform because, unfortunately, they're held hostage by the right side. Since they converged, they're kind of held hostage by the further right view of their party now, right? So there's no real separation there anymore. Like if you look, and I know there was a big deal about this last federal election about how much more vote percentage the Conservative government got over the Liberal government. But if you actually sit down and look at it, it tells you very much, if you look at those numbers, very much of our country is left-leaning. It just is. The only difference is there's three parties to the left and one party to the right. Right. Mm-hmm. And that's the reason why there's not more than one party to the right, because they know that if they did put more than one party to the right, then they would never get elected as prime minister again, because that'd be too big of a division and they wouldn't be able to make up the difference. Right. So to me, I would just go as an independent. I could not align myself with either one, because I could not stand up in public and go, oh, yeah, well, there's no such thing as climate change. Right. Or there's no such thing as a female's right to choose, or some of the other issues that they have a very hard time coming to grips with, saying, hey, listen, it's got to be kind of this certain way. There's got to be certain societal norms that have to be upheld here, and they just don't want to do it. So it's hard for me to say, okay, well, yeah, I would look like they would.
Well, Steve, I have certainly learned a lot about you tonight, and I learned a lot of information from you. So thank you so much for allowing me to interview you. Is there anything you'd like to add as a final remark to our interview tonight?
The only thing I would like to add is I would like people to actually vote. And that's probably one of the most concerning things I have about Wetaskiwin. And I noticed a couple of the individuals you've already interviewed went to the side of, oh, well, too many people in Wetaskiwin think negatively. They complain a lot. They do this, they do that, they do the next thing. People in Wetaskiwin don't vote, which is shocking to me. Everyone has the right to an opinion, but if you're not willing to go out and spend the 20 minutes it takes to vote, I'm not sure that you have the right to complain. Right? So that's one of my biggest issues. I think in the by-election, there was less than 30% of the population went out and voted. Yet I'm sure probably more than 20% of the population is on Wetaskiwin Rant and Rave.
They need to combine the rant and rave with the way to vote. Have a poll on the rant and rave.
So it's hard for me to say, oh yeah, well, I'll take your opinion into consideration, and you always want to take other people's opinions into consideration for sure. But when they complain about something, yet they couldn't be bothered to go out and exercise their right and actually turn around and say, hey, you know what, this is how you get to choose and you get to determine the future of your city. This is where the direction comes from. If you don't go out and vote, then you don't get the right to input in that direction. And that's only taking away from your own self. That's only taking away from your own right to do so. Right. It's hard for me. So if one thing I'd like to say to close this all off is go vote.
Nice.
Vote, and vote. If they let you vote 3 times, vote 3 times, but I don't think they will.
I wonder if there's going to be any citizens that listen to all 20 hours of these interviews and make the most informed decision they can make. Because I'm doing them, and it's definitely a lot of information, and it's great.
I've tried to encourage as many people as I can to listen.
Yeah.
Be informed.
Be informed.
That's one of the big things for me. And I'll say this quite publicly, is myself and Wayne Nielsen, we have had some pretty big head smashing minutes, whether it be in private meetings or whether it be in public displays. But one thing I will give that man credit for is he does the work, and he's always informed.
Yes.
And that's the bottom line. That's all you can expect from a city councilor. You might not always agree with their viewpoint. You might not always be able to come to terms with how they think, but the main thing is, you go there, you put in the work, and you come to an informed decision.
Right on. All right. Well, with that, Steve, thank you so much for letting me interview you again. I really appreciate the time you spent.
I appreciate you putting in the time.
You're welcome. No troubles.
And you should be running for city council next.
Well, you never know. All right, guys. Good night. It's almost midnight. Actually, it's over midnight. It's the next day already. So we're going to go to get some sleep and do some more interviews tomorrow. Goodbye,
Wetaskiwin. I'm going to close up work.
All right. Good stuff. Thanks, Steve. We'll talk to you later. Bye, Wetaskiwin.
Have a good one.
You bet.
See ya.